made New York an even more exciting city to live in and work in. And I was also very happy when I learned that Sweden is part of this green transition. And that's something that you'll hear more about today. So this webinar is about the green transformation of the real estate sector in New York and how Sweden can inspire and be part of this transformation. And Sweden's environmental journey started back in the 1960s. And back then, the country was heavily dependent on fossil fuel, and people demanded change. And in 1969, the Environmental Protection Act was introduced. And by that, Sweden became the first country to hold companies responsible for their emissions and environmental footprint. But the real change towards green transition came during the oil crisis in the 1970s, and it was based on the principle that we should try to shift away from any source that we don't have and try to shift to more sustainable sources of energy. And in the 1980s, there was a shift towards centralized district heating, and that was a crucial step in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And in 1994, Sweden became the first country to shift the responsibility for recycling product waste from municipalities to the business sector. And you might, in fact, know that Sweden is a country that is importing waste as a means to heat our buildings. Since the mid-90s, Sweden has actually managed to combine economic growth with falling emissions levels. And today, Sweden is a global leader in the greener part of the Sustainable Development Goals Index and a leader when it comes to innovations. And a question that is often asked is which technology is key in helping countries to become leaders in green transition? And I think the answer is that it's through collaboration and connecting the public sector with the private sector, with academia and citizens. So we believe that through new ways of working, we can reach a positive change. And today, we'll have the opportunity to listen to a dialogue between a dialogue on collaboration and innovation in the real estate sector. And Hines, one of the largest global real estate developers, has delivered, along with Norges Bank Investment Management and Trinity Church Wall Street, a new landmark building, 555 Greenwich, which exceeds New York's 2030 climate targets for office buildings by over 45%, and is aligned with the New York City's goals to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. So different stakeholders were brought in for collaboration, and already available technology was adapted to the New York market, and inspiration was taken from the Swedish ecosystem. And it's now time to scale up to reach the climate goals. And today we'll hear Michael Izzo, head of carbon strategy at Hines, and Will Sibia, founder and CEO of Herbs, discussing how change can be reached through collaboration. And I would like to hand over the virtual mic to today's moderator, Mike Vigiano, president of real estate at the government relations firm Kazirer. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I want to thank the Consul General for that wonderful introduction. I'm very honored to be here as part of certainly the Consulate General's event today and part of UN's Climate Week, which kicked off yesterday. I have with me two colleagues I am very pleased to get to work with frequently. So just very quick, again, I'm Matt Vigiano from Kazirer. We are a New York City-based lobbying firm who works at the intersection of industry, real estate development, and government. So we have a little bit of experience trying to navigate these critical questions. And some of what we do is get to work with great organizations like Hines and Herbs. So I'll turn it over to Michael Izzo to introduce himself. Please, Michael.
Thanks, Matt. Excited to be here today as well. Mike Izzo from Hines, a global real estate developer in 27 different countries, a very vertically integrated business from investment management all the way down to property management engineering. And I had the pleasure of meeting Will Sibia probably 2 years ago. And I think the moment of change for me was exactly 2 years ago during Climate Week, New York City in 2019, where I got to meet him and four of his other colleagues. And at that time, we were under development with a new project. And we were collaborating. And essentially what I told them was, take the building that we have and tell me what you would do in Sweden with the New York climate. And that just kicked off what I would say, not only collaboration, but also friendship going forward. And we've exchanged many ideas. And it's not only the new development that we're focused on, it's really eliminating the roadblocks and implementing it within existing buildings where I think the maximum potential can be reached.
Thanks, Michael. Well, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, hi, good morning, everyone. I'm very excited to be here as well. I mean, this is very exciting times we're living in, and it's a privilege to be part of this communication and conversation. And also, it has been a journey, and been very grateful to be part of the development work that we got a chance to participate in New York. The property development that Mike is working with is probably one of the largest portfolios in Manhattan. And for us to have a chance to look at it and to work with partners who are very open to new ideas and innovation and trying to push boundaries, it is really groundbreaking. And I hope that we are able to showcase this solution and replicate and scale it as a transformative solution for New York as a whole.
Great. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Michael. Thank you to the Honorable Consul General again for that warm introduction. So we're going to try to organize our conversation today around a few main topics. First and foremost, I think, as the Consul General noted, innovation has been key to your work together. So I'd start us off with the premise that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a recent report on our forecasting sort of the global warming and the targets we'll be achieving. So this is, I think, certainly top of mind for us during Climate Week. For some of us who are joining and the participants, this is a topic that's top of mind all of the time, not just this week. So I want to ask the question, Michael and Will, just how much innovation is necessary? Do we have the tools we need at hand already? Do we need to continue pushing the envelope on technological development to try to address this issue quicker? So really, do we have what we need, or are there things that we're going to need moving forward? So I'd love to hear maybe from Will. Let's start with you.
I think, as the Consul General's addressed when she started, which she said the innovation is not necessarily about technology, it's about collaboration and sitting together with all stakeholders and with ideas. So I believe the technologies we've always had, and technologies are existing today. So it is more about putting the technologies to work for us. And during our conversations earlier on as well, I have given the analogy of automobiles or cars. We have been driving cars for over a century, and we're not driving the same cars, but that was solving a problem, solving a communication and a transport problem. We did not wait for Teslas to come in and start using it. So we should use the technology to solve what is needed to be solved today with what is existing, instead of waiting for technology to come and help us, because there is no silver bullet.
Right. We can't wait.
Yeah.
We can't wait.
It's also amazing that the electric car was invented in the 1800s, right? Or right around the turn of the century. It wasn't a new invention that came up. So I think the misnomer is that innovation is invention, and that is not the reality. Innovation is really having an open mind and being optimistic and really collaborating with others to modify the business models that are in play. Disruptive technology is not disruptive because a single piece of technology. It's disruptive because of the business model behind it. Uber does not own a single asset. They do not own a single car. Airbnb, the largest hotel, does not own a single bed. So in reality, it's the disruptive nature of the business models and the ideas that are the solution and the innovation.
I like that. So it's upending the market, so to speak, through different ways of thinking, right? And I think the two of you had come together around one project in general that the Consul General mentioned at 555 Greenwich Street. Can you talk a little bit about maybe some of the ways you were able to innovate there, do something new that hadn't been tried somewhere else, or maybe give us an idea of the difficulties and challenges that you face? So maybe let's do that. The difficulties and challenges and what you were able to do in new innovation with what exists today.
I wish we could say we did something new. We did something new for New York, but that's not necessarily new for the world. Really, the innovation was the holistic thinking and the circular systems approach to the energy systems within the building. And essentially, all we tried to do was reduce the amount of waste energy, recycle and upcycle it back into the building. So as the energy was being produced, make sure it stays within the building as long as possible, so we didn't need to take more from the grid. And that was essentially the solution there. I mean, it was, 4 really main components: geothermal piles, which is nothing new. I mean, the Romans have been doing it forever, right? Radiant slabs, which is not a new technology. It's water piping and concrete. Doesn't get more sort of primitive than that. And then it was really a dedicated outside air system with full electrification of air source heat pumps. But our buildings are already electrified. We use heat pumps in the opposite fashion: air conditioners. Any air conditioner, any refrigerator, I mean, that's essentially a heat pump. So there was no new technology. It was the systems thinking that really was the innovative approach.
So this sounds like we have layered together existing technologies in different ways. It makes me think of duplication, I'd like to ask you guys, how easily can these systems or the layering of systems be duplicated and implemented elsewhere? So I keep thinking of frontline communities, environmental justice communities as one beneficiary of this kind of layering. So if you could talk a little bit about replication, how do we bring this out to the wider world in New York City and then maybe globally too?
Well, you want to take that since
Well, maybe you can start us off.
Yeah.
We're playing a little catch up with Sweden in New York City and the United States. So we'd love to learn from your experience here.
Well, one of the first things that hit me when I came to New York, apart from the sheer size and the real estate market, the size of the real estate market and the opportunity, once we came to know about the Local Law 97 and the Climate Mobilization Act and the Protection Act, was essentially the ambition to decarbonize and ambition and the scale to decarbonize. And I remember one of the first things which I told Mike, and there was pretty informal conversation, after we got to know and like, okay, how we work together. I said, well, US or New York is so big and they want to go from 0 to 100 in a single step. Like running a marathon, you still have to do it one step at a time. And every step towards the right direction will end up, making you do the marathon well. So our premise, or how we looked at it, and that has been our discussions, even when now we're working on Empire Building Challenge together, is to see how do we start changing at the lowest level, to look at the bottom of the pyramid to start changing. And another thing that is coming more and more clear to us is that you actually need the economic growth needs a new market solution. Like a new market solution, when you introduce to the market, that'll add to the economic growth. And when you work at the economic growth and a new market solution that's at the bottom of the pyramid, it is bound to help the majority of the population. You're bound to get in new contractors. You're bound to get people into new green jobs. You're bound to get the local industry, local contractors employed, instead of just doing single building at a time and a new building at a time. So that's how our approach has been. And we have discussed this a lot, and Mike can add more on the work that they are thinking of doing with LMI communities in New York.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, we need to transition our electricity system and the energy system that comes into our buildings, but a lot of that will come from jobs that are not hyper local to New York. So the renovation sector is the most prominent business sector that we have, and I think bolstering that is key to this transition. But the reality is that those communities pay for the emissions that Manhattan emits. I mean, 60% of the energy is consumed in Manhattan, and there's maybe one power plant in Manhattan. Someone can fact check me on that, but most of the majority of the power comes from those exact communities that you're talking about. So we need to reduce the demand that our buildings need. But also, you know, these ideas are really apportioning the economic value in the appropriate places. And that is not done in the market currently.
So it sounds ground up conversation, preparing different communities for new opportunity that comes from this ground up collaborative approach. I want to switch gears here a little bit and talk about the co-creation process. We have two gentlemen from, I would say, maybe different disciplines, and certainly different ways of thinking. So maybe you could talk about the process that you two undertook, and maybe point to some examples that we can see in 555 Greenwich that highlight this co-creation process.
I think we first started with a lot of long walks. But
relationship building is part of that, right? I think that's important. Yeah. Nice that you took some long walks together to start to build this relationship. Was it a process of maybe understanding each other's best practices and looking for alignment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, Will wasn't coming with a very narrow lens or a single technology. In reality, what he was telling me, and he probably wouldn't say this, I will say this, that he was just trying to tell me to think better and think more clearly and more holistically. So in the end, I mean, I met Will in probably April of 2019. He came for Climate Week that same year in September. In October, he was pitching an idea to our team. And in November, we were in Sweden looking at solutions. So the reality was there was this exchanging of ideas very quickly, and it wasn't to provide a solution, a Swedish solution specific to New York. It was understanding the market first, where the roadblocks are, where the gaps are, how do we collaborate? And then the result of that collaboration was a co-creation of an idea that could work for New York to meet both the economic and the environmental goals of the city and the venture.
Well, let me ask you a question. If there were no limits, no barriers to additional things you could have done at 555 Greenwich or in any of the projects you work on, can you give us some wish list things you would have wanted to incorporate, either here in New York City or in some of the other projects you work on?
Well, I mean, we're trying to do this with NYCERDA and through the work that we're doing through Empire Building Challenge. And essentially, we are telling them electric is future. You'll have to get away from gas and steam. And you'll have to look at the bottlenecks and the weakest links. And we have actually identified the weakest links, and we have actually shown them how using natural gas and fossil fuel in the building system and steam is actually inherently not efficient. And then you're deploying systems that are actually sending it to the spaces where people are occupied, which is the way all the energy is in the end consumed or exhausted. Even that is not efficient. So what we want to show is, since as an outsider who's not in the New York City, not in the New York City real estate, it'll be very hard for us to change the structures, the procurement processes, how the financing happens. So the only thing we could do is we could essentially showcase the simple solutions which can be deployed as easily as possible at the natural cycle of investment. And that's what we're doing. And just to understand this also, it has taken at least me a long time together with Mike, because working together with him, he could say, okay, well, this is the problem. You cannot just do this. You know, you have brokers in between who have different agendas, or they see the market differently. So that even the regulatory incentive was there, even though there was incentives to deploy some of the clean energies, I think the key is to understand what the market needs and where the gaps are, and to give those places, give the gaps a simple solution. Because if you look at as a market as a holistically, how it works with different actors, different stakeholders, is very complicated. It's fairly complex. So what we are trying to do, we're trying to give a simple and profound solution to a complex problem. And that takes time.
So you touched on something interesting in your response just now. And Mike, I'm going to pitch this to you. So you ran into some barriers, right? I think creation and co-creation is about free exchange of ideas to come up with a new idea, right? So I'll put on my former government hat for a second and fully admit that New York is no stranger to bureaucracy, and we work very closely with city agencies all of the time that are working their way through code requirements or even mandated ways of doing things. So what are some of the barriers to co-creation that you found in this process at 555 in New York City, maybe specifically, that some of our listeners and guests can think about or better understand, I should say?
I think everyone's approaching it from a technical point of view. And the truth is, this is not a technical point of view. It's not even an investment point of view. The capital wants to be deployed, but we're relying on one entity in order to implement that. So for us, actually, we got to a point where I wasn't convinced that this solution would move forward. So we brought in academia, UC Berkeley Center for the Built Environment, to be the neutral third party who had studied these solutions for years, if not decades. So for me, it's really providing that techno-economic analysis and bridging the gap between all the stakeholders, the technical folks. And I happen to have a technical background, so I know enough to be dangerous. Obviously, in real estate, I understand the way financing in real estate works, and I've lived in New York, so I understood the social norms and the issues that we've created in our, what I would call hyper efficient but hyper siloed society. And I think that's the biggest gap. There's no one trying to bridge those silos to provide a solution that speaks to everyone. Because when you speak to everyone in these triple and quadruple helixes, then the solutions get maximum uptake. And I think that's undervalued, to be honest, to a very large extent within the market. We will not solve this with technology.
Right. And you're touching on I think a really critical, and certainly maybe one of the most important words in our, and even just the title for this event, which is collaboration. Bridging the gap between the silos that you mentioned. So can you, both of you, maybe we'll start with Will, since Mike had the last word last time. What are some of the ways in which you were able to knock down barriers between these silos that Mike was just describing and maybe as a follow-up to that, talk about some of the balance you were able to achieve once you started to break down these barriers.
I think we were actually not so influential in breaking down the barriers, to be honest. We actually just, our aim was just to support Mike and his team to put the idea across and empower him with the right solutions and tools so he makes informed decisions. So he should get comfortable and Heinz team gets comfortable to speak to other stakeholders, because the barriers are essentially at multiple levels, right? The first barrier is formed when the engineers are speaking to architects, right? The architects have a different way of looking at it, engineers have a different way of looking at it. And then you look at the people who are doing the energy models and, you know, who look in their silos. So I think the whole structure of how the developments are generally done and conceived, it's a very structured process and it has been functioning for many years. So for us to come in and start pointing to that, it would not have helped. So we just assisted, you know, Heinz team with the right tools. That's what I would say.
And having the best information available too. I think a lot of developers or architects, engineers, brokers, put everyone into the mix who touches real estate, really just thinks in their hyper silo. The breakthrough for me was really studying Sweden and the Nordics and how they've come so far. And then also even studying in New York. Well, you know, where does my building energy come from? What are the goals there? How is it produced? What is the art of the possible? Are these goals realistic? And start to understand the energy sector, what the problem was, what the waste energy problem is, and really look at the system as a whole, not just the four walls of your building. Because once you start to do that, then you start to really understand the various driver and hurdles within the market.
And so through this kind of process of collaboration, it sounds like you guys started to look at this building differently and look at buildings in a different way together, which is, I think, astounding, you know, coming from, and we'll freely admit, as we said at the outset, the US is a little behind. Looks like about 4 decades maybe worth of work behind. I would say though, we did have, I think around the same time, our two countries passed environmental protection acts at the national level. And so we clearly recognized then the need for more concerted effort in protecting the environment, protecting our waterways, and really looking at the built environment particularly. If maybe you could talk as a last question before we switch topics one more time, because there's been something that we've woven throughout this conversation that I want to touch on, which is incentivization. But before I do that, I wanted to see if maybe you two could give us a sense of how do you balance these different ecosystems between the United States and Swedish, and were you, let's start there. How do you achieve that balance?
As an outsider, you know, I think what is, of course, you know, every system has its pros and cons, but one thing that New York and US has for itself is the sheer size of economy and sheer magnitude of real estate. And also, if they really start the ball rolling, it's a big ball. The inertia is massive. You know, compared to what Sweden does, it's still a fairly small country. It is fairly homogeneous. New York, whole world is looking. So as a market, and especially when it comes to real estate, you can't have a better market globally than what you have in New York. So that is a very big driver. And that essentially also motivated us that, okay, if we can do something in New York, that could be seen globally. And that has actually helped us to get the right partners on board because we're doing in New York. So let's say if we were doing in a small town in, I don't know, in Sweden, probably even 3 times more innovative, if we can call that word, even though, you know, we are against the innovation as technology, but let's say we're doing something more innovative, to highlight that at this stage will not be possible. So I believe one of the biggest strengths that New York gives is the reach of what is being done there that can be seen globally. That I think is very hard to beat by anyone else.
I like that. We are a great laboratory, if you will, for what could be scalable globally. So it's to my friends in government who may be on this and maybe listen later, like we should think more about that. How can we help everybody else be sort of the guinea pig, if you will, for some of these innovations, creations and collaborations.
Well, yeah, it hits on the next point of incentives in that really the uptake and the acceptance of the solution is a direct result on how far we've come from the status quo. To Will's point, if they did it in Sweden, it wouldn't be as novel or new of an idea compared to what they're doing anyway. Here we essentially have a blank canvas and are able to move the market a lot further than other cities or other countries may be able to do so. So I think that's an important point, in that really incentivizing those first movers and forward thinkers is not in the structure that we have today.
So let's talk about incentives. Everybody likes a good incentive. A lot of people behave based on incentives that are there. So I'm asking this question and the following question, starting at the premise that penalties that force actors, developers, even government, because they build as well, to make changes only when required. I think paints us into a narrower corner. So you catch more flies with honey. So what are some of the incentives we should be looking at to help the New York market move forward? I'd love, Will, maybe to start with this because from an outsider's perspective, you could tell us what's worked elsewhere that maybe we want to think about introducing in New York City, and then we could talk maybe some slight specifics with Mike too. So, Will, why don't you tell us what's been working and incentivizing people everywhere else?
I think New York has a unique position, and what we've learned, and especially the work that we've done through NYC, I mean, they've been very helpful to what we have been propagating to them and telling them. They have been very open to the ideas and the knowledge. So I think to some extent the incentives are working, but I also acknowledge during this process to see that the regulatory incentives can only go so much. The uptake has to come from the capital markets, because financial markets who will start investing in this, that's what needs to be driven. And I second or double or triple Mike's point that they will have to start incentivizing the first movers, because first movers risk in this market, which is very advanced in how it has been worked, right? In terms of structures, it has been working it's a very robust economy. It has gone through many ups and downs, still been surviving, right? A New York real estate market, if you think from a real estate market point of view, it's a very robust market that has gone through a lot. So for them to change the ways of working, they would need more than just incentive or a fine to say, okay, change now.
Right.
And I think that's where I think that they can put more in to incentivize the first movers, create some more showcases that can be seen so people can actually come and feel that, okay, there's the possibilities there.
So that's really interesting suggestion that you put on the table there, Will. New York City obviously is not risk averse, right? We take risks. We like to take risks in New York. Bigger the risk, bigger the payoff in a lot of ways. So maybe the idea here is to think about incentivization as in a tiered fashion. You get the biggest tax breaks or the biggest subsidies if you are amongst the first 5 to 10 teams to maybe try something, and then it maybe tapers off a little bit, but the incentive is still there because we think this is a good thing. Mike, let me ask you a question. Do you think that on the forms that incentives are most attractive in New York? Is it tax breaks? Is it a height bonus and an FAR bonus, if you will? What do you think is really going to move the needle for developers in New York City to want to do this more, try to integrate these kinds of innovations into their next project?
Yeah, before I answer that, I'll say two specific things. One is that to think that a penalty is an incentive, I think is a flaw. And the second is that really energy and carbon emissions are a distraction to the building. Real estate is a distraction to a tenant, and energy is a distraction to a landlord. And it's such a small amount of the business model within the buildings that it doesn't hardly move anybody. And even with the fines so great, the reality is it's only above a certain cap, and that expenditure can be easily withstand from, you know, the largest real estate investors. So I think we need to incentivize the market a bit more and the first movers, and really start to create an innovative market around these ideas and start to move people in a different direction. And that is also incumbent not just on the legislators, but I think also the capital markets, the tenants, the landlords, and everybody together to show the true benefits. Because right now there's, I would say, a lack of trust to some extent, and these barriers that get inserted in between that create inaction or almost promote inaction to some extent.
Very interesting.
Yeah. And I can't speak to whether tax or, you know, FAR bonus, there's many sort of complexities around that, but I think both would be easily welcomed and create a new financial market to move in this direction.
So you really have to put all of the possible incentives on the table and maybe think about how to layer them, how to make them more accessible to not just the Heinz of the world, but even down to the individual property owner scale.
And cut the bureaucracy out of it. We need to make these solutions simple. The more complicated we make them, the more hesitancy there will be to uptake them. And it's also that you know, collaboration of not only the building sector, but also the power sector and everyone in between. Because the reality is, the more we reduce demand and energy at our building level, the less new infrastructure that has to be put onto the grid and transition to a renewable way. So I don't think all those costs are appropriated and fully valued. So it's really moving that money around and really sharing in the responsibility, savings, and cost.
So I'm looking at the time. It's about 9:39, 9:40. We wanted to leave some time for questions from some of our guests, either that we should consider globally here. Any questions folks might have on some of what we talked about in the discussion leading up to now. So if you have a question, we have a Q&A field. We'd be happy to field anything you guys might have or be interested in learning more about. So I'll turn it over there. Maybe while we wait for questions to filter in, I have a question about the demand side. So the rest of the world, right? We have the guys who build everything, build buildings, and then we have the consumer side. And I'm curious, what can a better incentive for this kind of development be, what can we do to influence from the demand side, the supply side? Should the city also want to consider incentivizing consumer behavior by rewarding like everyday citizens for choosing to live or work in a more sustainable development? Is it just everything should be on the table? And then we have two great questions that I'm going to get to in the chat. Thank you. So let's start there. Should we be incentivizing the consumer side?
We need all the tools possible in order to reach 2030. I mean, the science says we need to cut more today than we do from 2030 to 2050. So the truth is everything needs to be on the table. And it is very much a behavioral issue on many levels.
I think the everyday citizen would enjoy some cash tax breaks for choosing to live in a more sustainable building or work in a more sustainable office building for sure. I want to get to the questions we have in the chat. How would you advise a mid-sized developer to start a journey towards net zero? What are some of the steps that they can take? Is it just hiring herbs? Is it maybe just thinking outside the box? How would you guys advise somebody who owns several properties who's looking to do something more innovative? I turn it over to you both.
Mike, do you want to go first?
Sure. I think it's looking at the natural capital that's being implemented to the building, looking at the end of life cycle of equipment and making sure that they make the right choice. So don't commit to fossil fuels when you're replacing your equipment or near the end of life. Because at that moment, what you're doing is committing another 10, 20, 30 years, whatever the life cycle of that equipment is, to a fossil fuel future. So for us, even at a large real estate level within existing buildings, we've been looking at a floor by floor approach. We naturally implement capital at every lease term or turn. So how do we implement the right amount of capital and just implement smart capital at that point in time? But the short story is really getting off fossil fuel, looking to electrification, looking to heat pumps. Not only does it make your system more carbon efficient, but it also makes your system more energy efficient. The COP of heat pumps are much, much greater than your fossil fuel boiler.
So mid-sized developer who asked that question, maybe a floor by floor solution is the way to go, and looking what's already available to actors of a similar size. So another question we got, and thank you, Mr. Sanchez, for the question. I've definitely been wanting to dive a little bit more into 555 Greenwich. So can you, Will and Mike, highlight some of the achievements you were able to reach at 555 Greenwich?
Yeah, in the end, we expect and we've done a tremendous amount of modeling, probably more modeling than we've done in the past 10 years. But we expect even with 20, 30% safety factors to be 45% below the 2030 targets of the city. And just to put that in context, 80%.
That's incredible.
80% of the buildings in New York City will be facing fines, and we're 45% below that. We've gotten rid of our cooling tower, so we're saving 800,000 gallons of water. Through the radiant slabs, we're increasing thermal comfort that UC Berkeley's done a lot of studies of, and really providing a better indoor air environment with the DOAS system. So even though we've electrified the building, we're actually expected to use 25% less electricity than we would have. So that just speaks to the energy efficiency gains of heat pumps and electrification, looking at it from a systems point of view, not an individual product point of view.
How new were some of these systems in the New York City experience? Will, did you have to do a lot of maybe education and what's the right word here? Did you have to convince us over here on this side of the Atlantic how good these systems were, or do you feel like there was already an appetite? And maybe that'll be our last question.
Yeah, it was a journey for both me and Mike, because we knew that this would work. It is nothing, we are not saying something that is not working. We are bringing in the robust solutions, knowledge, and technologies that are existing other places in the world. So there's nothing that is innovative as such. So I think the thought process, the amount of time that we had to spend in just convincing people was probably the biggest barrier in this case, because for this project, capital deployment was not a problem, a tenancy was not a problem, and the building was to be built, especially this was started pre-COVID. So I think there was no other hurdles apart from education and convincing. And I think that's where Mike engaged in the academia that really helped, because then there's a local partner, local acknowledged partner with UC Berkeley Center of Built Environment that came and actually acknowledged, like, okay, this thing has been working, this is expanding in the US as well, so we should look at that. So yeah.
And to put a finer point on that, a lot of these solutions have been implemented in New York, just not in a full package. So there's little pieces here and little pieces there and little pieces somewhere else. We just took the holistic point of view, and it was the best solution to tie all these different pieces together to provide a more carbon efficient building. So it's really not even something new for the New York market. It's just we haven't done it at this scale.
I think that's heartening. You know, I think it's good to know we're not reinventing the wheel here. We're just thinking more creatively and integrating solutions in new ways, innovative ways, if you will. Well, I just noticed the time, we've gone a little bit over. I want to thank you both. I want to thank the Honorable Consul General for hosting us today. This was really fun. I know that we could do this all day. So thank you to our host. Thank you to Climate Week and the Climate Group as well for helping to put this on. And we hope that you all enjoyed a great conversation. So
thanks a lot, Matt, for hosting and moderating. I know it was painful and hard.
Oh, it was miserable. No, I had a wonderful time. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. Bye-bye.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye.